Okay, I'm Mike Hartmann, co-editor of The Giving Review with another co-editor of The Giving Review, my decades-long mentor at the Lined and Harry Bradley Foundation, Dan Schmidt. And we're going to be, really grilling Checker Finn today. Checker, your biographical material is going to be in the article, the post introducing this video. So I'm not giving you short shrift, but we will mention that you are Distinguished Senior Fellow and President Emeritus of the Thomas B. Fordham Institute. I think you're President Emeritus of the Thomas B. Fordham Foundation, right? So there's a lot
Same
of
thing. It's the same thing, really.
okay, a lot of emeritus going on there. We're
Yes.
yeah.
Speak for
Also,
yourself.
yes, okay. Also a Senior Fellow of the Hoover Institution. Has a long and storied career, also including at the Manhattan Institute, the Hudson Institute, the United States Department of Education under Bill Bennett, Vanderbilt, has experience in and with the nonprofit world from sitting on several boards, including, I think, the Philanthropy Roundtable. I think it might have all began, you can correct me, with a position you had in the office of Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan. So you can correct me, but if we can sort of start there, what would Daniel Patrick Moynihan, if you can speak for the dead, what would Moynihan think about the state of politics and public discourse today?
Whoa, Pat Moynihan, who was my mentor, going back actually to graduate school days when he was my doctoral advisor, and then dragged me with him to the Nixon White House, and then later to New Delhi, India, and then to the US Senate. And a few other stops along the way. I spent 15 years of my adult life in the shadow of Pat Moynihan, and it was a worthy shadow to be in. Let me say, I learned a lot, and with every passing day, as I watched the goings on Capitol Hill, I miss him more and more and more. He was a believer in getting things done, in actually sometimes compromising without compromising your principles. He reached across the aisle all sorts of times, and he was also thoughtful, smart, well-read, and learned. You may recall the quip when, it wasn't even a quip, it was a tribute at his funeral, when George Will commented that, Pat Moynihan wrote more books than most of his Senate colleagues have ever read.
Yeah.
And that's more true today than it was when Pat died, actually, because the learnedness, shall we say, of members of U.S. Congress has diminished, and people have retreated into their camps, into their silos, if you will. And Moynihan would find this just appalling, actually, as well as a lot of the policy decisions being made for no principled reason whatsoever. There is one recent development I think he would approve of. Let me say that. He really did believe in an income strategy for dealing with poverty rather than a social services strategy for dealing with poverty. He basically invented the idea of a guaranteed national income. Or if he didn't invent it, he certainly popularized it in the United States, and he tried to talk Richard Nixon into it, which he had partial success with. And the recent overweight, overwrought recovery bill that the Congress has just passed includes a remarkable amount of actual income transfer to poor people, and not so much by way of hiring social workers and technocrats to tell them what to do. So this, I think, Moynihan would approve of as a strategy. I also think he'd look at that overweight, overwrought measure and say, what have we come to? We don't care about the deficit. We don't care about the role of government. We don't care about a whole lot of things we ought to be caring about.
Yeah. You say he was willing to compromise and did so without compromising principle. I think it might be the case that many people don't think that's possible to do anymore. Do you agree, or what?
Well, it's harder and harder to do. In both in Congress and, at least as importantly, in many state legislatures these days. I watched the Maryland legislature fairly closely on education issues, for example, since I live in Maryland and for a time was on the Maryland State Board of Education. And I don't see much compromising going on there, either between the Republicans and Democrats in the legislature or between the Democrats who control the legislature and the Republican governor. So I think it's gotten harder at every level of government. There are occasional examples of things where people come together, usually small things, I have to say. But I think there's some convergence of view right now, for instance, on things like China policy. I don't think that's a completely one-sided view. Some nominee of Biden's got a unanimous vote in the Senate the other day. I mean, everybody voted for something, forgotten. So there are occasional examples, but God, it's gotten hard. And the main problem is that the people don't want to compromise. They'd rather grandstand and look to their base, as we say these days. Nobody used to really talk that way. And they also, because of the way elections are now working in most places, they're worried mostly not about their general election rival, but about their primary challenger, which leads everybody into their more extreme end of their own silo, to mix metaphors. Because if they're not there, some extremists will challenge them in the primary. This makes people get farther apart rather than closer together. As a lot of this has to do with redistricting and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. Is there anybody that could be likened to any current figure, politician or not, intellectual maybe even, that could be likened to Daniel Patrick Moynihan?
Oh, in the sort of public intellectual world, occasionally I have that feeling about David Brooks, sometimes about George Will. There are not many. In the Peggy Noonan, in the Congress, the Senator Ben Sasse might be a remaining example. They've been quitting, the ones that like to make deals and compromise. That's the problem. They've been or getting driven out. Several of them were driven out by Trump. Others have just quit in despair. Blunt from Missouri just quit the other day. He was a kind of compromiser, sort of, on the Republican side. And I think he just sort of said, it's not worth it. This is just no fun.
Yeah.
Biden used to be a compromiser. It remains to be seen. It remains to be seen.
Yeah.
Checker, since you've made some comments on a few of these issues with respect to practicalities in politics in terms of the extremes, is there anything in conservatism and on the other side of the fence, ideologically, that is distinguishable and you could point to, or Daniel Patrick Moynihan could point to and say, well, this is sharpened up and this is one of the reasons why we have this inability to get together? Or is it a transactional issue, really, where, as you mentioned, getting elected, getting primaried and all the rest, that has taken center stage and it's overpowering what could be, if you had people like Daniel Patrick Moynihan and others, a very interesting conversation at this particular time in history with respect to ideological issues?
Some of it is genuine and legitimate ideological differences that sometimes we've compromised and maybe regretted it. In the book that I co-edited with Mike Petrilli this past year, Yuval Levin of AEI wrote a superb essay on the kind of fundamental differences between liberals and conservatives when it comes to what's important in education. And with progressives or liberals putting sort of equity and justice at the top of their list of what matters, and conservatives putting citizenship and institutions at the top of their list of things that matter. And that we all compromised around some things that we sort of had in common, like academic standards, but caused each side to sort of end up feeling like maybe they neglected what they really cared most about. And having that in Yuval Levin's framing actually drive us legitimately apart for the next chapter of education reform, because we've sort of lost track of what we really value.
Is that happening with other issues as well, as conservatism moves forward? Does the Levin chapter's thesis apply to other contexts?
He would say, yes, it does. And he would be better able than I to cite more policy realms in which it applies. I follow the education stuff more closely than I follow other stuff. But yeah, I think there are some differences of principle, which are not the same as just differences in appealing to one's base. There's that is a different kind of difference. These are differences in sort of core values rather than whom are you pandering to.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, well, what do you think of the state of conservatism since? Well, we all say post-Trump. Let me put it this way to you: since Dan Schmidt retired from Bradley in 2017, how's conservatism doing?
Steadily downhill since Dan stopped. Everybody knows that, actually.
Yeah.
Um, Conservatism, there are, as in the Yuval Levin example, some stalwart conservative intellectuals who sort of picked up, you might call it the Irving Kristol mantle, and are flying it high. But the translation from public intellectual to policy and politics, conservatism is not doing well at all these days. Partly because populism has overwhelmed conservatism in the political sphere, and they're not the same thing. I joke that having in my lifetime now been abandoned by both parties, first by the Democrats and more recently by the Republicans, and now I'm left as a man without a party. Even though I don't think I've changed much over this period of time, they've just each abandoned me. So I yearn for a proper conservative party, a compassionate conservative party, if you will, but a conservative party. And we don't have one right now in America. Certainly not the Republican Party of 2021.
Yeah. Well, why don't we finish with part one there and pick up with part two in a bit here.